Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Understanding and Dismantling Racism. This is session 3 of a 4-session program, and tonight our topic is white power and privilege. Now, let's get started. Okay. Now, as you recall, in our first session 2 weeks ago, we examined some of the origins of this notion of race, and I proposed a definition of racism to help frame our conversation. In the second session, we introduced the concept of personal racism, cultural racism, and institutional racism. And then we looked at how institutional racism works and why it can be so hard to begin to dismantle. Now, in this session, we're going to explore how institutional and cultural racism institutional and cultural racism can deform our identities. And this is the identities of all people of all races. So let's begin again to look at our definition of racism. And that is that racism equals race prejudice plus the sanctioned misuse of institutional and systemic power. And you see I've highlighted that word power again, because that's a very important concept in this definition. Now, by power, we're not talking about something that is good or evil. In its simplest form, power is the ability to make things happen. Or on the other end, it's the ability to keep things from happening. But power in relationship to racism is the sanctioned misuse of institutional and systemic power to promote, to protect, and to enforce the racial hierarchy. And this power is experienced at 3 different levels of increasing intensity. So power to the first is what racism does to people of color. Now, this is the most easily identifiable, and it's what most people focus on when they work on racism. It includes all the ways that people of color are excluded and marginalized by racism. And this power really speaks to the consequences of racism. Power to the second is what racism does for white people. It's about how racism serves the needs of white people. And it speaks to why racism came into existence. Now, power to the second is really difficult to acknowledge and understand and comprehend for many white people. The truth is that we're so accustomed to the power and privilege afforded to us that we're often unaware of how we benefit from institutional and systemic racism. Often what we think of as just normal human behavior is in fact privilege that is granted to us because of what our skin color communicates to other people. In fact, racism requires that white people be in denial about power to the second. And in fact, white power and privilege means never having to think about what it means to be white, never having to think about being white at all. Sometimes explaining white power and privilege to white folks can be like trying to explain water to a fish. We're surrounded by it. We're immersed into it from the day that we're born. And white power and privilege is so deeply baked into our socialization process that, again, that we just think of it as being normative. And this causes many to scratch their heads in disbelief when people of color are unable to climb the ladders of success like we did or like our parents did. In fact, the default explanation for some white people for why people of color don't succeed is that they must be lazy or immoral or they're moochers. or they lack the necessary intelligence to succeed. Now, most of the work in this country to end racism stops at what we would call a Power One analysis. And stopping at a Power One analysis often leads to strategies that focus on fixing people of color. This, of course, lets white people off the hook by not looking at how white people benefit from racist culture, institutions, and systems. Stopping our analysis at power to the first allows white people to claim to be free from racism because we've purged ourselves from hurtful racist prejudices and behaviors. But racism doesn't continue to exist in this country because white people like to make people of color suffer. Racism continues to persist because white people benefit from it, even when they're unaware that this is the case. And there's one important thing to remember about white power and privilege. That having white power and privilege does not mean that your life has been easy. Certainly not. It just means that your skin color isn't one of those things making it harder. Now, the internal personal dynamics that drive power to the first and power to the second are internalized racist oppression for people of color and internalized racist superiority for white people. Internalized racist oppression, or IRO for short, is a complex, multi-generational socialization process in which people of color accept, believe, and live out negative societal definitions. These behaviors support and maintain the racial construct. Internalized racist superiority, or IRS for short, is again a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, and live out superior social definitions of self, and to fit into and to live out superior societal roles. These behaviors define and normalize the racial construct and its outcome, which is white supremacy. Now, as a way of illustrating how IRO and IRS operate, or how they work, I'd like to share with you two short videos. This first one is about internalized racist oppression and deals with the concept of colorism.
Look at a struggle many Americans face, the bias of skin tone. It's called colorism, and it's an eye-opening topic, and covering it was championed by a member of our GMA team. We recently lost producer Daisha Riley.
Yeah, this is such an important story, and Daisha felt that it was really important to shine a light on this problem that is so recognized in communities of color, but rarely discussed publicly. Deborah Roberts is here with more on this story. Good morning, Deborah.
Good morning, Cecilia and Michael. And I have to say that I am humbled and honored to bring forth one of the last pieces that Daisha produced for us. Once again, a provocative issue, many that I've had an opportunity to explore with her over the years. And this one shining a light on bias around skin tones, not among different ethnic groups, but within the same communities of color. Some call it light privilege.
She's pretty for a dark-skinned girl.
Their parents will call me negro, which means black in Spanish.
It's been an open secret for generations.
There's this like fetishization of light skin.
It was always black or white.
You know, don't get too black.
Colorism, prejudice based on skin tone, and a preference for light skin over dark. The unfortunate phenomenon spread across all groups of color.
Within Asian Americans, this model minority mindset to distance yourself from other people of color by like positing yourself as like the most like hardworking and law-abiding minority in this country in a way in order to kind of like gain favor with white people.
Dr. Joy DeGruy, who studies racial trauma, says colorism is rooted in proximity to whiteness.
The whole notion that white is the best, the correct, the most intelligent, the most right about everything. And as you move along the color spectrum, of the darker you are, the less important, beautiful, viable, capable, all of those things that the society has imposed upon us based on that notion of supremacy.
Its impact woven into American society and can affect every aspect of life. Take a look at the differences in wages for a dark-skinned African American, a brown-skinned, and a light-skinned African American. The study showing hourly wages among blacks literally rising as skin tone lightens. Lighter-skinned minorities viewed as more intelligent by employers, even with identical education as their darker-skinned counterparts. Experts say these examples of colorism have long-lasting effects of both mental and physical trauma.
The anti-blackness started with this whole idea that the darker you are, the less human you are. And so everyone's distancing themselves from that. I think multi-generational trauma is evident.
I hated the way I looked. I just wanted to like scratch the dark skin out of my face. One time I was in the bathtub and I wanted to stay in longer so my skin color could get lighter. I just thought that's how it worked.
Anti-colorism organizations like the Beauty Well Project in Minnesota work to end the stigma against darker-skinned people of all races who face discrimination from society as well as their own communities.
I know I was not alone. I know I'm not the only dark-skinned girl that has been bullied. You know, so we need more dark-skinned girls and boys just to speak out.
Colorism sparking a lot of conversations lately, even highlighted in a best-selling novel, The Vanishing Half. Here are some statistics that Daisha was able to uncover. Darker-skinned girls 3 times more likely to be suspended from school. Darker-skinned drivers more likely to be even arrested or pulled over. A big problem that we obviously need to do a lot of work on. Cecilia?
It is, Deb. Thank you. And we're going to start right now by talking about it. That's the first step. So let's bring in Amira Adway from the Beauty Well Project in Minnesota, an organization that empowers people to embrace their identity and culture. Amira, good morning to you. Thank you so much for being here to talk about, as we say, this really important topic. This is something that exists for Latinos. This is something that exists for Asian Americans, African Americans, so many groups of color. What can we do to combat this?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Colorism is so much embedded in cultures. It's something that started with colonizations, those countries that experienced colonizations, and also communities that have experienced slavery. And so it's deeply rooted in cultures. We have to teach people their identities. We have to teach people their history. We need to redefine beauty standards because that is a huge issue that impacts these communities. We need to empower and uplift communities of color.
No doubt. And Amira, how can people of color overcome their own insecurities and biases?
Yeah, this is so much trauma. I mean, this has been going on for years and years and years. So people are dealing with so much trauma, so much pain, and so they need safe space. We have to create safe space for them. We have to listen to them. A lot of times people don't disclose what they're experiencing unless they have safe space. So we have to create these safe spaces for them. We have to empower very early on. We have to start empowering young girls. That's why it's so important to have mentoring programs. Young people have to see representations in all fields. For example, journalism. They have to see people of color in all of these places that really represent them. That representation, it's so empowering, and that helps with their mentoring, and that helps them see that they can do whatever they want to do.
That's why we say representation matters so much. So let's talk about the next generation because we want them to do better. Quickly, if you will, how do we address colorism at an early age?
Yeah, early age, during early childhood, it's so important to intervene, and that is when we really need to reform school curriculums. We need to include young kids in school curriculums.
Well, hey there, GMA.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Bill's going to be setting up our next video segment now. And it's from a TV show called ABC Primetime Live. Some of you older people out there, maybe you remember that. This is a show, a segment that aired in 1991, which is why the quality of this video is not good. But I think you should be able to figure out what's happening. Now, the producers of this show put this segment together in order to show that racism still exists in 1991. Can you believe it? Yeah. But I want to invite you to look at this video from a different vantage point, okay? I'd like you to examine this video the findings in this video in terms of white power and privilege. Specifically, in what ways is the white person in this video afforded privileges and power that were not afforded to the black person in this video? Okay, so keep that in mind as you're watching this. So Bill's going to share that right now.
Tonight, nearly 30 years later, we bring you the results of a primetime investigation. We started this by going to the Leadership Council for Open Metropolitan Communities in Chicago. It's a group that tests for fair housing. We asked them to give us 2 testers trained in presenting themselves exactly the same way. 2 young men who could go into white and racially mixed neighborhoods with hidden cameras to record their experiences for us. During the 2.5 weeks, at times the 2 men were treated equally, at times there was ambiguity. But tonight, we're going to show some of the ways in which they were treated differently. Because this didn't happen just once or twice, it happened every single day. Meet John Cunin and Glenn Brewer. They work together at the Leadership Council. They're both from the Midwest. They went to Big Ten schools, grew up in middle-class families, even play on the same softball team. They're friends. 2 young men whose lives are virtually the same in every way but one. You can see. A few months ago, John and Glenn agreed to pack their bags and help with our investigation. Our question, how much difference does the color of your skin make in everyday life in America? For the answer, we went to the city of St. Louis, Missouri, where the 2 men moved into this motel and prepared to begin a new life. You really feel that you're equal?
Definitely.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The twist? Every day we'll be with them to show you what happens.
Set. All right. Let's go. Let's do it.
Let us tell you a little bit about how we're going to go about this. We're going to send John and Glenn into a variety of situations, and we're going to monitor what's going on from the van. We'll be parked outside. One of the first things John and Glenn do is take a look around the city, go to a shopping center to pick up some things they need. John looks at some clothes, so does Glenn. They do some browsing, and right away, something catches our attention. When John walks up to this electronics counter, it's almost instant service. But just a few minutes later, when Glenn walks up, he is ignored. Not 1, but 2 salesmen standing a few feet away. We didn't make anything of it until it happened again and again.
Need some help?
In the shoe department at this store, John gets instant attention and a hearty welcome. Yet when Glenn walks in just 3 minutes later, the salesman looks away. We run a stopwatch as the salesman continues to stare past. No hearty welcome for him.
I was standing there and standing there and standing there. And John just barely skirts the fringe of the department. The guy comes over and he's joking, he's laughing, and that did not happen for me.
Even when the 2 men stroll into a nearby car dealership, Glenn walks up to a new car right in front of the showroom window. Once again, we run the clock.
I walked around the car, kicked the tires, looked under the rear at the muffler. It's an enormous amount of time to me. to stand there and wait for me to spend my money.
So you're clear that they knew you were there?
Yes, there was a black salesman who looked at me and then looked away.
A black salesman?
The same salesman who was there in an instant, the moment John set foot on the lot.
We can work it out for you. What do I have to do to earn your business? Sign your shoes.
What about that? What about that?
Julianne Malveaux and Clifford Alexander both study the social and economic consequences of race in America. She's an economist at Berkeley. He's a consultant and former Secretary of the Army.
His life lesson is the same life lesson that the white salesman got, that this is a group of people that for some reason I should deal with differently, despite the fact that I might make some money from them.
That different treatment became apparent in another way when our two testers went to a record store. John browses quietly, so does Glenn in the background. But now, watch the salesman approaching from the left. He stops next to Glenn. He's not offering to help him, he's tailing him.
And when I moved, he moved. And I think after about the second or third time when that happened, it suddenly dawned on me. He is there strictly to follow me around.
I was surprised to see him trailing Glenn in the shop because he wasn't trailing me.
This salesman who followed Glenn around in that store, men like that would say to you, this is not race behavior. Black people commit more crime as a percentage of population. That's why I followed him.
Do you think that all 32 million black people should be judged by some statistic about crime in this society?
No, but the question is, what kind of blame do we put on this person?
I rest my case. It isn't a question of blaming the white person following. It's a question of understanding why he follows.
If this man had behaved suspiciously, if he had picked up something, put it down perhaps in his pocket, that would be one thing. He was browsing.
Nearly every day or night, someone treated Glenn like an outsider. For instance, one day, we locked the two men out of their cars, 40 feet away from each other. Glenn struggles all alone to get into his car. John, on the other hand, has a small crowd of passersby, offering information and help.
If you call the police, they'll come over and for you.
Everybody who came by in my car, it seemed, had something to say to me.
And you?
No help, no one.
One night, John and Glenn go for a walk in downtown St. Louis, one just ahead of the other. But when a police car passes by, it's Glenn who gets the pointed once over.
When he got to where John was, he rolled right by John.
But he stopped, leaned out the window, just to inspect you.
Yes.
And on another night, walking on a residential street in white South St. Louis, a truck slows down next to Glenn. Our microphone man leaning out and telling Glenn he's in the wrong neighborhood.
Go far south, man.
Hey. The implication there was we were not where we were supposed to be.
Which is in the north part of St. Louis, as far as he was concerned.
Yes.
So you're constantly doing this calculus of what am I going to do about this? Am I going to tell him to shove it? Am I just going to walk on by? Do I have the time, the energy?
What is the cumulative effect of it? How bad is this day in and day out?
It's the harmless kind of racism that if you accuse someone, I would say, but gee, that's not cross-burning, and yet it still grinds exceedingly small.
Every day, John and Glenn keep diaries, and the grinding is clear when we stop to ask about those impressions.
You think you could make it here? No problem?
Yeah, I think that I could make it here and set up here if I wanted.
Knowing what has happened to me, I think I would be fairly discouraged.
At this point, already?
Yes.
An emotional price is one thing. It's still another when the price is money out of your pocket. At a car dealership, John was told he could get a car for almost nothing down.
Financing available?
Glenn's told he'll need at least $2,000 down. Was it just a fluke? They try a second lot. They decide to ask about the same red convertible with the same salesman. First, how much of a down payment will be needed?
What do they usually ask down?
Anywhere from 10 to 20%. It just depends, sure. Well, normally the banks want anywhere from 20 to 25%. So you're looking at a couple grand there.
Already, John's advantage is as much as $1,000. And what about the price of the car?
You could probably pick it up for somewhere around the 9 range.
9?
I mean, if I could get you in the car for, say, 95 even, think you'd be interested.
Once again, a big difference. Since we heard all of this from the van, we decided to get out and see if we could get some answers. The manager met us first.
What do we got today?
Can we talk to John Novak? That salesman appeared, and we asked him why John and Glenn were quoted different figures.
Well, they're all different. It just depends.
Two guys come in looking at the same car. What's the difference? For him, the banks will do 10 to 20. For him, 20, 25? What's the difference?
Depends on the vehicle, ma'am.
They were looking at the same vehicle.
Oh, okay.
What's the difference? We never did get an answer. Is there a difference? And we're not the only ones asking that question. Experts say car salesmen consistently regard blacks as less sophisticated customers and try to make them pay more. The result, according to a national study, black Americans pay twice the markup that whites do, at a cost of more than $150 million a year. And another way African Americans pay for the color of their skin is job discrimination. Over several days, John and Glenn apply for all kinds of jobs, signing up for job services, answering the want ads. And from the very beginning, we noticed something subtle but unmistakable. Not just what happens, but how they're treated.
Call tomorrow and ask for Don.
At a storefront job service, both our testers pay a fee and sign up.
If I give you a list of jobs, okay? And there's one particular job on there.
John is told pleasantly it's against the rules to share a confidential job listing with a friend. But when Glenn gets that information, it's a lecture, complete with a little warning about laziness.
I'm gonna limit your jobs. I'm gonna monitor you real close. Because I've had people come in here, give them good job leads, they never show up. They never show up. Because they're too lazy to work.
How often, how many times would you hear lectures about laziness or showing up or drug abuse?
Quite often, in a lot of the situations.
More than once, John is encouraged about a job while Glenn is turned down flat. This dry cleaning business has advertised for help out front at the counter.
What's your phone application? The positions are taken. Positions taken. Still positions available?
As far as I know, yes.
Since John and Glenn have dealt with different people, we asked them each to go back a few days later to see if the same thing happens. It does. Glenn is told.
I really don't know anything about it.
John is told.
Yeah, they're still interviewing people.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Positions are still available?
Yeah.
These are situations. When you talk about a person's work, that's life-threatening to them. That's what they do.
At this point, there's only one more area to explore. John and Glenn need to find someplace to live. Right off, we start hearing something different.
This is a Catholic church 4 blocks up the street.
The building manager gives John a relaxed description of the area.
So you were being kind of welcomed to the neighborhood.
Yeah. Whereas I felt like I would be in boot camp, and he was the drill instructor.
I'm strict. I use whatever I have to enforce my laws.
He also made reference to the fact that he wanted to keep his building clean because it was not a ghetto.
There were other building managers who seemed perfectly cordial and businesslike.
What's included? All of this, gas and electric?
Yeah, we furnish a stove and refrigerator.
Glenn left satisfied he had the same chance as anyone else at getting this apartment. But 5 minutes later, John arrived.
Is it a good neighborhood?
No. So far, pretty good.
Yeah.
But they're moving in.
Really?
Yeah. I just showed this to one more move. Yeah. I don't know how long it's going to be this as good as it is, but.
Have a nice day, racism. On the surface, let me show you this place, and you know, I'm not going to do anything illegal as soon as you're gone, and one of them was just here.
And this is what happens when John and Glenn spot this sign at another apartment building and go in to inquire. John goes first.
So one day, it's got air conditioning.
The manager gives John a set of keys.
The key system don't work, here's your master. Okay. Okay?
John tours the vacant apartment. He's told it's available immediately.
Got a couple other places I'm going to look at, and if I decide on this one, I'll be back. I'll have this filled up. Okay?
Okay, I appreciate it.
All right, well, thank you.
Bless you and have a good day.
John leaves. And listen what happens when Glenn walks in. Suddenly,
The apartment has been rented?
the manager explains that regrettably, early that morning, a woman paid a deposit on the last available apartment.
Oh, so
called in earlier this morning.
There's nothing for Glenn to see, so he leaves.
Bye-bye. You too. Okay.
Once again, we decide to go in search of an explanation. May we ask you a couple of questions? These two gentlemen came in, and when this one came in, you gave him keys to an apartment, one bedroom with air conditioning. But when this gentleman came in 10 minutes later, you said there was no apartment available.
No, I told this gentleman I had a call on the apartment.
But we pointed out what he had said. He had told Glenn the apartment had been rented by a woman that morning. Yet he showed John the apartment in the afternoon.
Oh, ma'am, I am not prejudiced. I got Mexican, I got Jewish, my God.
How many black people in this apartment?
There's none.
At this point, the building owner appeared, trying to throw us out.
I'm asking you to move your camera, okay? Out of the apartment or call the police, okay? We have never discriminated. As long as they don't have 4 or 5 kids, we do not have any empty, so out.
Later, Glenn remembered the manager's parting words.
He said, "Bless you both." And that infuriated me. How dare you wish blessings on me after you have just insulted me, after you have just told me that I can't live here because of the color of my skin.
We will have moved a step forward when white people feel as angry and as outraged about this as we do. I mean, we're not surprised, but whenever this is confronted, I'm confronted with this, I'm angry.
You're sitting in a democracy and you want to say, Jane or Johnny, you can go all the way. This is open. This is America. But you know what just happened to you in the store. And you know that that's America too.
In quite a few ways, yes, it has been rough.
After 2.5 weeks, our investigation is over. And even these two professional discrimination testers say this was an experience that opened eyes.
I didn't realize the big differences in all these situations, and I couldn't really believe it, that it was happening.
You walk down with a suit and tie, and it doesn't matter. You carry yourself in a very respectful manner. It doesn't matter. Someone will make determinations about you, determinations that affect the quality of your life. And the only basis is the one thing that will not change about you. I'm not going to take off black. I'm going to be black forever.
A footnote. We chose St. Louis for this report, but we think it could have been any city, and the National Studies on Discrimination bear this out. That's why our experts, Malveaux and Alexander, both wanted to emphasize that they think if things are going to change for black Americans, it will only be when national leaders in business and politics say, this can't go on, it's just not fair. And finally, after we completed our interviews with John and Glenn here in New York, we couldn't resist just one more test. The two of them, just a few blocks from our studio, as they each tried to catch a New York cab to head home. Watch as the first cab sails straight past Glenn to pick up John.
I gotta go to LaGuardia?
Okay. So let me get back to our PowerPoint. Okay. Dr. Peggy McIntosh from Wellesley College in Massachusetts does a lot of research and writing on white power and privilege. And she compares white privilege to an invisible knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, blank checks, and free passes that each white person is given at birth and that they can draw upon throughout their entire lives. In other words, white people do not need to apply for white power and privilege. It's given to them whether they want it or not. And white power and privilege is not something that white people can disavow or walk away from, because it is the consequence of how others see you and relate to you. It's not what you may or may not believe about yourself. Along with internalized racist oppression, these socialization processes support and reinforce each other like a couple engaged in a dance. And this dance helps to maintain the racial construct. This IRO-IRS dance has been going on for 400 years. And each partner in the dance plays out their roles by acting and reacting to each other in step to the music of institutional and systemic racism, which has been the soundtrack of our lives. Now, as an example of how this dance works, I want to talk about the confrontation that occurred in Central Park in New York City between Amy Cooper, a white woman, and Christian Cooper, an African-American male. This was back in May of 2020. And for the purpose of this reflection, I want to focus on and look at this incident from the viewpoint of IRO and IRS. Now, in doing so, I'm relying heavy on the work of African-American priest and scholar Brian Massengale, so I'm going to give him credit for this. First, let's recall what Amy Cooper did. After a black man tells her to obey the posted signs requiring her to leash her dog in a public park, she tells him she's going to call the police. She says, quote, "I'm going to tell them that there's an African-American man threatening my life." Then she does just that. She calls 911 and says, quote, "There's a man, an African-American man. He has a bicycle helmet. He's recording me and he's threatening me and my dog." She continues in breathless voice, "I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops immediately." This, despite the fact that Christian Cooper's camera recording the event shows that he made no threatening moves towards her, spoke to her calmly and without insult, and kept his distance the entire time. In short, she decided to call the police on this black man for nothing more than politely asking her to obey the park rules. And she made up a lie to put him in danger. As Massengale points out, she knew what she was doing, and so do we. The situation was completely legible, as my academic friends would say. What did she and the rest of us know? Why did she act in the way that she did? Massengale goes on to demonstrate how white power and privilege played out in Amy's behavior. She assumed that her lies would be more credible than his truth. She assumed that she would have the presumption of innocence, and she assumed that he, a black man, would have the presumption of guilt. She assumed that her race would be an advantage and that she would be believed because she's white. She assumed that his race would be a burden, even an insurmountable one. She assumed that the world would work for her and against him, and she assumed that this frame of the black rapist versus the white damsel in distress would be clearly understood by everyone, the police, the press, and the public. She assumed that this black man had no right to tell her what to do, and she assumed that the police officers would agree. But Massengale also points out the way that IRO played out in Christian Cooper's response to Amy. You see, Amy assumed that Christian would and could understand all the assumptions that she was making. She assumed that he knew that in any confrontation with the police, things would not go well with him. And she was right. He clearly understood what was at stake, which is why he had the presence of mind to record what was happening, to keep his distance, to speak slowly and calmly. And so the IRO-IRS dance continues. But thankfully, this incident did not become lethal. And this is because people of color have learned over the centuries how to survive when the dance music of institutional and systemic racism begins to play. Now, for our last session, we'll talk about power to the third, which speaks to racism's ultimate power to control and destroy everyone, and how racism misshapes our identities and holds us hostage to lies about ourselves. And then we're going to close by reviewing at least a few ways, that white people can become good allies in the struggle for racial justice. But in the time remaining, let's address any questions or comments you might have. Again, remember, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And then Bill will, they'll be private, and Bill will be the only one to see them, and he will relay them to me as they come in. All right. So, Bill, have we got anything yet?
We do not yet, Tom, but
Okay.
would you have a minute to discuss the phenomenon that of IRO and IRS? Is that not unique to the United States? I'm sure it's unique in some respects, but does it occur in other countries too?
Yeah, it certainly does. It does play out in other countries too, without a doubt. To the degree and to the particulars of each, I don't want to venture into, because I just don't know. But certainly it does work these ways. Okay. Now, there's a question about racism against Asians. I know that people have been listening to the news, and you know about the attacks in Atlanta against the women there, and also, you know, the national statistics of a rise of racism against and hate attacks against Asians. Let me just say that, first of all, anti-Asian sentiments and racism against Asians has been in this country a lot longer than when President Trump tried to blame the COVID virus on Chinese people. Ever since Chinese people came over to this country, they faced all kinds of discrimination and discriminatory laws. There was a time, for instance, when Chinese men would come over to work on the railroads and some of these other large construction projects, but it was against the law for Chinese women to come over, because they didn't want these guys to settle down. They wanted them to work, and then when they were done giving their labor, we wanted to send them home. That's just one example, and that was in the 1800s. So the Asian stereotypes out there still persist, and certainly during World War II, and in the buildup to that war, and then when the war broke out in the Pacific, the internment of the Japanese Americans in internment camps during the war is another example of how anti-Asian sentiment has existed in this country for many, many, many years.
Tom, we have two quick questions. One person asks you to repeat what IRO and IRS mean.
Okay, let me get that. Let's see, all right. Internalized racist oppression is a complex, multi-generational socialization process in which people of color accept, believe, and live out negative social definitions, and that these behaviors support and maintain the racial construct. Now, internalized racist superiority is a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, and to live out superior societal definitions of self, and to fit into and live out superior societal roles. This behavior defines and normalizes the racial construct and its outcome, which is white power and privilege.
Thank you, Tom. There was a reaction to the New York City incident with a question, why do you suppose that Amy called for the police rather than ignoring him?
I think she was, I mean, let me start out by saying it's I hesitate to try to, totally get in the mind of Amy Cooper on this, but my sense is that, she felt indignant and a sense of privilege and that this Black person had absolutely no right to tell her what to do. And so she exercised that privilege to her benefit. That's the way I would read it.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment, not a question, that one of the participants has started reading the autobiography of John Thompson Jr., and he reinforces the colorism that was the first part of tonight's presentation.
Yeah.
The next one is a question. It says the Atlanta police, as of earlier today, said there's no indication of racism. Shouldn't we wait for the evidence before making assumptions?
I think that's a good thing to do, to wait. But and let me just make it clear again. As horrific as that action was, the reality is that even if that wasn't racism, it's pretty clear that attacks against Asians in this country is on the uprise, and that has to be condemned. Now, in terms of what happened in Atlanta, this is a real difficult story to kind of explore and look at and to understand, because there's so many things, moving parts in it, and again, I think we have to wait and see what the police report is, but I also want to caution us about some of the narrative that's being kind of created around this incident that really needs to be examined. And one of the things I find about racism is that racism never enters the room alone. It doesn't. Often racism is mixed in with sexism, with misogyny, with classism, with all kinds of other racial constructs and racial oppression as well. So we have a situation where first, here are predominantly Asian women who may or may not have been involved in the sex business. That's already a layer of oppression and discrimination in terms of the sexualization and the exploitation of women. Second, it appears, at least from what I've read, that this young man took advantage of and paid for sex with these women. Now you might think, well, how could a man pay sex for these women and be racist towards them? Well, that's really not that uncommon. If you think back to the age of slavery, it was the normal practice that masters would sexually exploit the female slaves that they owned. And while sometimes there may have been some real genuine affection, most of the time it was not. It was not. So it's not, just because this had to do with sex doesn't mean it didn't also have to do with racism. Again, we don't know for sure, but keep your eye on that piece, as people will try to say, well, it can't be racism because it was sexism. Not necessarily.
Thank you, Tom. There's a couple of comments and then a question. So one of the attendees recommends the book Caste, C-A-S-T-E, for additional information on this topic. And there was an appreciation of the Diane Sawyer video for you sharing that one specifically. Then there's a question which may be beyond the scope of tonight. It asks, would you want to discuss the doctrine of discovery?
Oh boy. For people to the doctrine of discovery was a teaching taught by the Catholic Church during the time of colonialism and of discovery of the Americas, which basically gave permission for the conquistadors and for other white Europeans to come over and take native land, because these, Native Americans probably didn't have a soul anyway. It took a while, but the church finally changed its mind on that. But it still is there on the record, and it is something that needs to be repented and amendments made to try to overcome the effects of those horrible theological decisions.
Thank you, Tom. There's a question: how has the Black Church supported the Black community to cope with living in a white society?
Mm. Well, those of you who had the opportunity to watch the Black Church documentary on PBS, if you haven't seen it, I would strongly suggest it. The Black Church has been a means of survival in a racist culture and in a racist society from the beginning. The slave owners thought they could give them the Bible and cut out all the parts about liberation and just feed them the line, slaves be obedient to your master. But these slaves, these African Americans, they were too smart for that. They began to read Exodus. They began to put 2 and 2 together. They began to see that Jesus was about liberation and not about slavery. So that's really good. Now, in modern times, I'll tell you one of the things that really was instructive to me. I lived for a time in Miami, Florida, and while there, my wife and daughter and we belonged to a predominantly African American church. And one of the things that I found so sad and so telling was when churches, Black churches in particular, would offer workshops or programs for their young people that were basically called, how to survive an encounter with a policeman. So that's one of the things that, that Black parents have to deal with every day, that when their kid goes out the door, that they may not come back. And so you have to train them up, and it's called The Talk. I also, have a biracial grandniece and nephew, great kids, but I know that their parents, my niece, who's white, and her husband, African American, they worry about them every day as they go out the door, saying, this may be the last time I see him. And they get the talk all the time, what to do and what not to do, and how to survive when you come into contact with a policeman. It's a sad thing. Here in Naperville, it's officer friendly, but for people of color, it's a whole different reality.
Thank you, Tom. There is a appreciation for you having discussed the doctrine of discovery. There's a question about contrasting a white person that commits violence and a perception that that person's allowed to talk about his motives and why, what his life circumstances were that caused him to do this, whereas a Black person would not be allowed that kind of opportunity. How do we call this out while also following Christ's example of showing compassion for those who do evil?
That's a tough one, and I know exactly what you're thinking. There is a tendency that when a white person commits a horrific act of violence against people of color, that it's typically what we do, especially if it's a mass killing like this. If it's a white person, we typically say, well, this was a troubled youth, or this is someone who definitely was probably suffering from mental illness, and that, that there must be some kind of reason, that was beyond that person's control as to why they did what they did. But when it's a person of color, And when it's someone like, especially if they were Muslim or Arab, it would immediately be called terrorism. And we never stop to think, why would that terrorist do this? Or to think about the trauma that in that terrorist's life that might have caused him or her to commit an act of terrorism. So it's a double standard, and it certainly is part of that whole motif, or that part of that whole racial construct that white people are basically good, and if they do something wrong, well, they must have had a good reason, right? So, but black people do something wrong, they're just violent, and that's just the way they're made. So what do you expect? You know, that's part of the narrative that is always in the background with a lot of these stories.
Thank you, Tom. Just a frame of reference, we're at 4 minutes before the hour. And the question is, I wonder if that talk, the talk being the talk that the African-American family would have to have about the police, that talk that is shared all of the time is traumatizing to the family as well.
Yeah, it's traumatizing. Of course it is, but it's survival. I mean, it's a matter of whether or not your kid's going to survive. You know, whether or not, he's going to walk into a situation thinking that he's going to be treated as a loving human being when it may not happen. It's unfortunate. It's terrible that the talk needs to even be done. I don't think black parents enjoy doing it, but at some point they know that cute little black or brown child of theirs one day is going to grow up to be a teenager, and he's not going to be looked at as a cute little black boy or girl. He's going to be looked at as a threat. And unless you prepare your children to deal with that, to understand it, then you're putting your child at risk. That's the calculus that's being made here. That's the calculus. I think it's sad and terrible that it has to be done, but I certainly understand it, and I certainly wouldn't judge it.
There's a question: how do we change the narrative? That's that's the whole question.
Right. And and this might be, I'm glad this is kind of at the end. We're going to cover that next Thursday. When we talk next Thursday, we're going to talk about how to become an ally and how can we disrupt the narrative and start to change that. Okay. But in terms of what's going on with the Asian community, because we have a lot of Asians here in Naperville, I think the first thing to do is to reach out to the Asian people who you work with, who you encounter, and just ask, how are you? How are you feeling? And I want you to know that I support you, that I'm here for you, and that I'm ready to join you if necessary to protect you and protect your family. And then we need to it's the whole saying, if you see something, say something. And that means that, it means taking a risk. Having white power and privilege is not something we can just take on and off. So the question is, what do we do with the power we have? And one of the things we can do is to interrupt and to stop bad behavior. When that crazy uncle or aunt of yours who comes to dinner every Christmas Eve and starts ranting off on sexism or racism, you need to just to challenge that. And you don't have to be a jerk about it, but you need to say clearly, I think that what you just said was wrong. I don't agree with that. And some people want to claim that that's cancel culture, but people that use cancel culture as an excuse for bad behavior just don't want to take responsibility for what they say and what they do. And they think freedom is being able to do whatever you want without consequence. But that's wrong. That's not freedom. That's license, and that's an exercise of power. So, but tomorrow, next Thursday, we'll cover this stuff.
Great. We are just at the very top of the hour. There's some appreciations in the chat for the presentation tonight.
Sure. Okay, our last session then, folks, is going to be on Thursday, March 25th at 7 at the same link. Hope to see you there. And by the way, I'm hoping to have recordings of all 4 of these sessions available sometime as soon as we figure out how to do it. Okay, so take care. God bless. See you next week.